in Introduction to a Biography of Ordinary Man, Section 3, the title is From Philosophy to Theory, the Science of Ordinary Man. So far we've begun in the foreword. This is Laruelle's methodological recommendation. Begin with the leap. Begin, in his case, begin, and ours, as long as we adhere to our reading of Laruelle's thought, begin outside philosophy, begin outside Greco-unitary thought, begin with the one, that is to say, begin with man or ordinary man or humans as multiplicities. And from there you'll see philosophy with new eyes. So begin with the collapse. Begin with the collapse of the world, with a capital W. Begin with the collapse, in particular, begin with the collapse of difference in its two forms: anthropo-logical parallelism, which is the lowest grade of difference, and anthropo-logical difference in all its forms. So this absolute beginning is outside all the predicates of Greco-unitary thought and outside all its calculations, because philosophy, the human sciences, the sciences of man, the social sciences are all forms of calculation in terms of predicates, and at best they can give us only only a possible human being, and most of the time not even that. They fragment man into all these different predicates and have no concept of man as such at all. So the move in section 3 of the introduction is from philosophy to theory, the science of ordinary man. He begins, the science of real people is no longer a philosophy or a mixture of anthropo-logical prejudices and mathematization. So we need some way of getting out of this sort of mix, this indeterminate mix of anthropological prejudices, which belong to the human sciences insofar as they talk about human beings or society, and of mathematization, what he calls earlier cheap mathematization. So both of these are processes of dumbing down. That's one of the meanings of what Laruelle was saying in the foreword, that philosophy and its avatars called the human sciences is lacking in rigor and is lacking in humanity. Maybe one could say lacking in the human, lacking in humanness, lacking in humaneness. So the science of real people is going to be different from that, and is going to be drawing its essential characteristics from its object. In fact, it's going to have the same characteristics as its object, man, ordinary people. The science of real people is individual and minoritarian, and so multiplicitous. It differs from a philosophy in several ways. It is a thought that, and we have a list here, and it's interesting to look at the list. First, in terms of the characteristics of this new non-philosophical thought or theory. It's rigorously naive, it's real or absolute, it's theoretical, it's descriptive, and it's human. So when we look at that, the odd one out is theoretical. We're getting naive versus reflexive. So to give the characteristics of philosophy and its avatars, it's reflexive, it's hypothetical, odd one out, it's practical or technical, it's constructive, and it's anthropo-logical. So in the rest of this section, he's going to spell out what these characteristics correspond to and argue for this sort of demarcation between theory and philosophy, or thought and philosophy, in terms of these traits. But it's interesting to see, we'll see it later, that contrary to the idea we might get from looking at the other traits, it's naive, real or absolute, descriptive, and human, we might get the idea that somehow it's non-theoretical, but in fact Laruelle places the theoretical as part of the essence of the science of real people, which we can understand, I suppose, easily enough on an ordinary idea of theory, that science is necessarily theoretical, but is also, because of the commonality of the traits of the object, humans, and of the science of humans, he's saying that people are, or ordinary or real people, are essentially theoretical as well. So that's something he will have to develop in what follows. So the first point is developing the idea that the science of ordinary man, of ordinary humans, is rigorously naive rather than reflexive. So philosophy can't become a rigorous science because its circular essence prevents it. So we don't have much to go on for the moment about the circular essence of philosophy, except this idea of the anthropo-logical difference or parallelism. So philosophy is, and the human sciences, which are not rigorous sciences, are caught in this to and fro between logos, or theory in loose, non-rigorous sense, and anthropos, or man as defined by a single predicate or a single set of predicates. Man is defined by a calculation of predicates, and that's where the logos becomes itself calculation to be able to define man. So that's the circular essence, and the thesis of Laruelle is that this anthropo-logical difference and difference itself is circular. The only prior reference we had to the circularity was earlier when he talked about man as, in essence, identity. So identity is not a self-mirroring. Identity is the naive, non-reflexive, absolute, and hypothetical, yet still theoretical, descriptive human essence of ordinary humans and of their science, because ordinary humans and their science are not in a reflexive or reflective relationship. They're the same thing, which we'll see later. So this circular essence of philosophy and of the human sciences is sometimes called the correlationist circle, or it has had other names before. We could call it the relativist circle, because the concern with relativism was prior to this specific technically constructed concept of correlationism. So philosophy and its avatars are, by definition, by their very construction, relativist, and they're caught in a circular process, and we need a thought outside that breaks the circle, breaks with the circle, and the principle, although Laruelle rejects that word, but the essence that crucially breaks that circle is science. Laruelle tells us becoming scientific is the essential predicate and telos of philosophy, but the science in question remains a mere philosophical predicate. Here I think he's claiming to know or to say more than he can know or say. It's true, lots of philosophy has aimed consciously or unconsciously at being scientific, at becoming scientific, but that's not always the case. Husserl aimed at a science of phenomenology. Heidegger broke with Husserl on that point. The logical positivists and the logical empiricists were aiming at a sort of unified science, but the later Wittgenstein was in total rupture with that model. So Laruelle is going beyond what he's entitled to say, and that poses a question for me, because he condemns philosophy as the calculation of predicates, and for me that poses the question of how much of Laruelle is still calculation and how much is the thinking of the essence and identity of real humans. Here I think he's indulging in the calculation of predicates to characterize philosophy, and so there's something one-sided and inaccurate. There's a sort of a lack of rigor on that point. But the science in question remains a mere philosophical predicate. So by not being able to define or give a concept of the essence of man, the philosophies and the human sciences are unable to give a real concept of science. And so the whole project becomes indeterminate, imaginary, Greco-unitary fantasy. So Laruelle comes back to his first, I'm not sure if it's his only, but his first point, developed over and over again in different formulations and with different perspectives and consequences. You have to think science straight away from its own phenomenal requirements and get out of the aphoretic circle of philosophy, where the goal of getting out of the circle, the goal of escaping correlationism, is itself part of that circle. So anti-correlationism in its let's be kind and say in its unsophisticated form is itself correlationist. So the only way of getting to a science is you start with a science, and you start with rigor straight away. And that means, according to Laruelle, being deprived, for reasons of positive sufficiency, of the aphoretic essence, which is the circle of difference, constitutive of unitary philosophizing. The essence of the science, of the empirical or individual real, is its non-circularity, its non-reflexivity, its naiveté. So this essence is not attained at a transcendental level by a process of transition. At an empirical level, yes, we don't, because we've been infected with philosophy. Even Laruelle started with philosophy in his educated state, when he'd been educated and so contaminated by philosophy. Laruelle started with philosophy and got to non-philosophy, and then that was in the Principle of Minority, and then totally reversed the perspective and began with the science of real people, began with the one, and that's the real beginning in the transcendental sense, whatever the empirical details are. So you begin with the one, you base your thought on the one, and he actually declares a principle when everything he's been saying up to now has been against principles. This principle of the sciences is the principle of real imminence or identity, a principle unknown to philosophy, and a principle which holds for the empirical and transcendental sciences. So I think strictly he's speaking a little freely here in his use of principle, although the main idea is that this principle can't be based on difference, and he calls it the principle of real imminence or identity. So the principle of real identity will be one of its names, and it has to be alogical. The problem with the principles he's discussed earlier are that they have, we're not talking about an logical content, we're talking about the problem of a logical status for the principle. So if we neutralize those two dangers of difference and logical status, it may be okay to talk about, at least in one particular context, of a principle. So we have this common basis between the science of ordinary humans and the empirical sciences. The common basis is this non-circularity, this imminence and identity. And that's the naivete aspect of things. So if you're inside the circle, there's no trick, however sophisticated you get, for getting outside the circle, for breaking the circle. There's no way out. There's no method that starts in the circle and takes you out. There can be some sort of pilgrimage or mental voyage or whatever, or series of affective and cognitive shocks. So maybe some sort of shock therapy in the philosophical sense, but there's no way or method. You just have to be out, and that's a question of absolute naivete. So that's a transcendental naivete. It's not being, can't cultivate to get out of the circle, cultivate naivete and no longer read any books and go into the woods and get out of philosophy, or find some wild humans brought up by wolves, or some sort of commune out on the borders of civilization. That's the wrong image, and even if we can't use that as a technique, sort of make ourselves brought up by wolves retroactively, maybe we could try. It will be illegal, but maybe we could try and get our children to be brought up by wolves. But that whole process will be so in the politico technological would not be superior to philosophy. And then he has a little dig. Nothing is superior to philosophy, which is the very spirit of superiority. I think as we examine Laruelle's progression in this book, that he is claiming superiority, but he's trying in every way to relativize, weaken, depotentiate, dephilosophize that notion of superiority. But in fact, he is claiming superiority. It may be, and that's a second question, because we asked the question of how much is Laruelle indulging in calculation as opposed to theory. And we can also ask the second question, because they go together in Laruelle's terms. We talk about reconciling rigor and humaneness, and how philosophy is careless and inhumane. So we can wonder to what extent this sense of superiority that comes up every now and then in, or maybe it's all over the place, in Laruelle's discussion, to what extent that sense of superiority can be attributed to what Laruelle calls in the foreword the human or to human aspect, or his occasional anti-philosophical vivacity. So anyhow, science suppresses the circle and no longer passes through a circular process of determination. I think we can put this in parallel with an earlier point that Laruelle makes, where he says that every science is born with the project of covering the totality, that science is one could say, the dream of a total theory, the dream of a theory of everything. So that's what accompanies the birth of science, but in fact that's a secondary phenomenon. The actual birthing of the science in its essence is the breaking out, or the breaking up of a circular process of determination. So the breaking up of philosophically determined epistemological obstacles. This is because the setting outside the circle of science in general ensues from the real itself, which has never been circular. So insofar as we're dealing with the real object, and that's the birth and the continuation of a science for Laruelle, we're outside these circular processes of determination, which would blind us to the real. So this is not a disguised philosophical operation, but the experience of the positive phenomenal content of individuals or of ordinary man, the very foundation of this science. So he is speaking in particular about the science of ordinary humans, although the methodological lesson is more general and applies to all sciences. But you're not going to get out of philosophy in the sense that Laruelle defines philosophy by philosophical means. Something else is required, and this requirement is to be found in experience. It's in experience defined in a non-empirical sense, because empirical notions of experience are or caught in the Greco-unitary circles of anthropo-logical difference and calculation of predicates. All these circular closures that we've seen in the previous sections. So we need an experience, which we'll go on to see, is not a-theoretical. That's a lure, an ideological lure that is not desirable and not even attainable. So this experience is theoretical through and through. So it's seeking for a vocabulary for what how this science of ordinary humans can be described. It is a non-positional science of, in parentheses, a non-positional science of the real. So once again, the of is necessary for the linguistic grammar or linguistic syntax, but is inappropriate, is out of phase with the transcendental syntax, because this non-positional science of the real does not take the real as an object. It does, in particular, it does not constitute the object, but that is to say the real, but the science of the real belongs to the real, is identical with the real, or as Laruelle says here in this paragraph, it merges with the real. It merges with the imminent, non-thetic and finite experience it has of its object. So it's a transcendental science. We're getting an answer to why he considered it was okay in the foreword to begin by talking about a science of man. It's not an empirical science, although it deals with experience. It's a transcendental science. So, as such, it's pre-philosophical, and this naivety is not some sort of negative predicate, an absence of sophistication. It's a positive naivete, and it merges with the real. So the real is a presupposition of thought. That would be philosophy that presupposes the real or not. In fact, even when it thinks it's presupposing the real, for Laruelle, it's caught in the circular determination, so it's caught in the hallucination of the real. Thought is non-thetic of itself. That is to say, unreflective or individual with an A. So it's non-thetic of itself. We're sort of getting the same thing twice there, because the of is in parentheses. So it's not presupposing the real, and it's not presupposing itself or even posing itself. It's just there as unreflective, as an identity outside the mirror play of difference. So here it's very clear that Laruelle situates difference, if we're looking at the Lacanian trinity, or three registers. Laruelle situates difference in the symbolic and the imaginary, with a primacy of the imaginary, and not at all in the real. The real is characterized by identity and not by difference. So we're talking about absolutely naive science, devoid of constitutive philosophical operations, and his naivety can no longer be critiqued, reflected, overcome by philosophy and its consciousness. There is going hyperbolic again, because one, he's presupposing that he's characterized the unique and universal essence of philosophy when philosophy may not be encompassed by this calculation of predicates. Laruelle himself comes to talk about his own project in terms of philosophy, non-standard philosophy or forced philosophy, which will be philosophy not just with other predicates, that will be the breaking the bounds of the circle, but outside that sort of predicative definition and predicative determination. So saying that his position cannot be criticized, this absolutely naive science cannot be criticized by philosophy, that's a sort of self-immunizing strategy. He's disallowing any sort of critique that could be conceived or categorized as a critique that whatever it thinks of itself or claims, that could be categorized as a critique coming from philosophy. And Laruelle thinks he knows already what philosophy is. And so once he's categorized something as coming from philosophy, it's over. He doesn't need to listen to it. It's just wrong. And one has the feeling, I don't know, that critique itself, at least in these early stages of the project, all critique is for Laruelle automatically categorized as philosophical, as philosophy, and so wrong. Wrong, inappropriate, inaccurate, careless, beside the point. And this sort of self-immunizing strategy is probably very important to create a space for his new science. And we can see, well, it's in danger of setting up a mirror, a reflexivity, that if you're inside his new language and his new continent, you won't be critiquing it. But we can see from his development that that's false even for him. And I think there's a sort of anthropo-logical, in a good sense of anthropo-logical process that is necessary of just learning the language, the new language that Laruelle is proposing, learning the concepts, learning the ideas, learning to live on the continent that he's opening up. And if we go far enough so as to become indigenous to that continent, then Laruelle will, I suppose, accept critique. So on a charitable reading, Laruelle is self-immunizing himself from critical objections with, one must understand, a promissory note that in the future, whatever future that is, so we'll call it a transcendental future for the moment, in the future, critique will be authorized. Critique is authorized if it comes from that transcendental future. Can that transcendental future empirically exist today? That's a tough question. And if it did exist, would Laruelle accept it? That's the problem of when Zarathustra said, "Go away. It's only when you have renounced me and become yourselves that I'll come back." And when Zarathustra came back and the higher men had practiced his advice, Zarathustra was not at all happy with the result, and that's life. That's probably one of the experiences that Laruelle has to deal with in his description of his complete description of human experience. So it may well be that Laruelle, as an empirical human being, greets with open arms all critiques that can plausibly claim to have lived inside this new type of thought. Or empirically, he could be sort of closed up, more concerned with advancing his ideas and not being bothered by objections that slow him down or take up too much time or energy or effort to get into understanding them. Because objections aren't just sort of little point by point things. Objections can come from a place that is maybe itself another continent that Laruelle didn't even imagine could exist. So getting into a new language that arises in a new continent is a big deal. Creating one is a big deal and takes time. And getting into another one to understand if the criticisms are at all useful or very similitudinous may well take too much time, and so just be ruled out by the empirical Laruelle. But the transcendental Laruelle is not able to rule out as definitively as this passage seems to imply. He can't, by his own principles, he can't rule out some sort of critique from something that calls itself philosophy or that calls itself non-philosophy, but that Laruelle is going to categorize as philosophy nonetheless. So that's a question mark for the moment, and I'll stop there.